The Mercy Seat by Johnny Cash. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Well, voters headed to the polls in Alaska, Arizona, Florida, Oklahoma, and Vermont Tuesday in a big day of state primaries. In Alaska, the incumbent Senator Lisa Murkowski is at risk of losing her seat against the Tea Party candidate Joe Miller in what could be a huge upset. With 77% of precincts reporting, Miller leads Murkowski 52 to 48%, a margin of about 3,000 votes. It'll be at least a week before the final results are known. Miller is a Gulf War vet, former federal magistrate. He was endorsed by former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin. Miller had spent less than $200,000 as of early August, compared with more than $1.4 million for Murkowski. But Miller received funding support from the Tea Party Express, which pumped about $500,000 worth of advertising into Alaska Airways ahead of the election. Meanwhile, several other states held big races Tuesday. In Arizona, Senator John McCain beat former Congressman J.D. Hayworth by a wide margin in the state's Republican primary. McCain spent more than $21 million in the race. In Florida, Congressman Kendrick Meek defeated billionaire real estate mogul Jeff Greene in the state's Democratic Senate primary. Greene lost the race despite spending as much as $26 million on his campaign. In Florida's Republican gubernatorial primary, billionaire businessman Rick Scott pulled off an upset victory over Attorney General Bill McCollum. Scott poured in upwards of $30 million of his own money on the race. For more on money and politics, we're joined from Washington, D.C. by Chuck Lewis, the founder of the Center for Public Integrity. He currently runs the investigative reporting workshop at American University. Chuck Lewis, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about the significance of these primary races and how they relate to money.
Well, they're all incredibly interesting, and it's hard to draw one single conclusion. What you mentioned about Alaska, I think, is possibly the most interesting of the states. In the case of Alaska, you have outside money coming in, and a new group, obviously, active in politics in this country, the Tea Party movement, playing a role there. If Murkowski loses, that is absolutely huge because, of course, her father was the governor, and that's a big name up there, and she's an incumbent and all those things. So that's a case of I guess it's the part of it is the Palin phenomenon, and of course whatever the Tea Party money, but also non-money, just people did up there will emerge in the coming days. In the case of Florida, there are a couple of interesting cases. In the Meek election, the gazillionaire who went against him actually lost despite spending a ton of money because there were scandals about that person, and suddenly began to fade in the polls in the last weeks of the days of the campaign. But as you mentioned in the last race, the McCollum race, the billionaire in that case won. We have a problem in this country, as you and I have discussed over the years, of millionaires and billionaires substantially peopling our political process. I mean, several years ago, I know that 40% of the U.S. Senate were millionaires when less than 1% of the country are millionaires. I think those numbers are higher. I haven't seen the latest numbers, but it could be as high as 50 or more percent now, just in the Senate alone. So what we're seeing increasingly over these years in a multi-year spread is the increasing activity of outside groups influencing elections and self-funded candidates who basically have enough money to build up name recognition and to enter the public fray. And it's very hard for an ordinary person who may be immensely qualified but not personally wealthy to enter the political realm. And so a lot of these elections are a reflection of that. In the McCain race, my understanding is he outspent his opponent, who was well known and has been around, but I think he outspent him 7 or 8 to 1 at least, something like that, and a huge advantage financially. So incumbents always generally win, and folks who have money spend the most money generally win. That's as old as time itself, and it continues. There are a few interesting wrinkles, as we were just discussing.
I mean, of course, in the very close race in Alaska, Miller actually spent way less than Murkowski. In the case of Kendrick Meek, he spent less. But in the case of the upset of Scott over McCollum in the gubernatorial race in Florida, I mean, he spent a remarkable amount of money. What was it, $39 million of his own money?
Right. No, and that's what primaries and isolated elections, even in a handful of states, it's often hard to draw conclusions. What I was talking about are general broad trends. So you're right, an underfunded candidate winning perhaps in the couple of the states you just mentioned, that's unusual. What we don't know, at least I don't know enough, is the micro why part of that. It sounds like in the case of Florida, the very wealthy candidate against Meek imploded. Basically, his candidacy went south fast. And then that's a case where the media coverage of that was enough to decimate the candidacy, and money became a non-factor. In the case of Alaska, lots of times grassroots activity and organizing and low turnout, by the way. Usually primaries have very low turnout, which means if you energize a group of people, you can actually, it can be noticed and you can even win occasionally. And so Alaska is, I'd like to see the turnout numbers, and I'd love to know how much the Tea Party folks or groups on their behalf spent there, because the actual contribution numbers are obviously not the whole story.
And the money can be turned around very occasionally when that does become the issue, and that really angers people. Meek spending, what, more than $2 million, but the self-funded Greene, his opponent, the real estate developer, spent more than $20 million of his own money, and that can really anger people when the media focuses on it.
Yeah, especially when they have a 200-foot yacht and they're ostentatious about their wealth, and they're also caught in public lies. Not at all helpful to a campaign.
The AP, the Associated Press, has called the Chamber of Commerce now with Citizens United the decision that allows corporate money to further flood elections and politics, has called the Chamber of Commerce the third estate. Talk about that, Chuck Lewis.
Well, they are the third estate, and they have been a huge presence in Washington for several decades. Tom Donahue is the president, and he basically is an exceedingly aggressive president of a trade association. It's not just a trade association. It is the preeminent corporate-funded institution in America today. And it does not have to disclose its donors. And, you know, he has made it, you know, they're spending something in the AP story, I think, basically we're talking 175 to 200 million when you add all the numbers up that they're trying to spend in just this year, basically, in terms of the election, both in their ads that are being spent around the country, their contributions by their various organizations. And you know, they have been obviously a very vocal opponent against Obama's policies in a number of cases, health care, the Wall Street bailout stuff, various of those pieces of legislation. The other part about the AP story that's kind of interesting that surprised me a little bit is they're not always, they usually are, but they're not always knee-jerk Republican. Normally, the chamber has always been heavily, closely aligned with the Republican Party, but money follows power, and if one party dominates both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, there will be efforts devoted by groups like even the chamber to get certain outcomes. According to the AP story, for example, the chamber backed the auto bailout and the bank bailouts by the Obama administration, which to some people would seem somewhat surprising, only because they were siding with the White House. But what is most disturbing about the chamber, and this is true of all these groups with no disclosure, is that the amounts of money are huge. And there's also keeping score. Donahue and his team at the chamber keep very close tabs on who's with them and who isn't, and who their friends are and who there aren't. And they're very, very tenacious about punishing people who are not with them. And I think there are people throughout Washington, D.C. that are actually afraid of the Chamber of Commerce. It is a very, very powerful force. And the irony is that the Chamber of Commerce building is directly next to the AFL-CIO, Labor Federation building. Both of these buildings, the heads of these groups, the head of labor and the head of business, both are on the top floor of their offices, and they look down on the White House. And that is a little bit misleading, because what labor unions do in this country is a small percentage of what the corporate community led by the Chamber. And the other thing about the Chamber is that Chamber has the Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers, and a whole array, half a dozen or more at least, many more than that probably, of other business-leaning groups, all spending astonishing sums of money. So, but the Chamber is the one who rallies all that activity, and the Chamber has been extremely aggressive in trying to block any climate change legislation or anything to do with the environment, of course. And what is interesting is some companies that are part of the Chamber are actually starting to disagree on that point, and there's an internal dispute inside the Chamber's members about what the Chamber policies ought to be. But they are an incredibly significant force, and it's great the Associated Press did the story.